This is my first time at Content Marketing World, and I have to say I've been really impressed by the sort of the enthusiasm and passion and a sense of community that exists, at this conference. It's really been, I go to a lot of these things, and it really stands out for me. So I'm grateful and honored to be asked to speak here and speak to you guys today. Typically, when I do a talk at a conference like this, I try to avoid talking about my own brand at all. Nobody wants one of us to come up on stage here and give you, a 40-minute commercial about our brand. But I want to caveat this particular talk by saying that's what I was sort of asked to do, is to sort of not give you a commercial about our brand, but to walk through sort of a case study of Quartz, so that you can draw some lessons and conclusions about how you think about building content for a mobile ecosystem. And I do think, I think that it's relevant. My content marketing team, so we have a creative services group that creates a lot of content marketing programs or works on those with our clients. They have the unique benefit, when you think about it, if you're a publisher, of sitting and working shoulder to shoulder, side by side with journalists and product people who are, in essence, unshackled from the commercial constraints that we all are. They can focus really zealously on serving a reader and growing audience without those concerns. And what we do is then extract the lessons from them on best practices, innovations, things that they're doing, and deploy them in service of our marketers. And so that's what I want to try to help impart to you today, give you the advantages that we have of sort of sitting adjacent to the newsroom. Unlike the New York Times, if you were here for the prior session, we actually don't have separate elevator banks. We're not big enough for that. We have one big open space. I don't have an office, and that does foster some interesting sharing. So what I also want to do is just quickly give you a little bit of context on what Quartz is and who we talk to, because the audience that we're after may not be directly relevant to everybody that's sitting out here, and that way you can use that context to figure out what lessons to pull out. Before I do that, just to orient me, how many of you, by show of hands, would classify yourself as very familiar with Quartz? Okay, almost everybody. So I will. What's that? Oh, good. Thank you, fans here. I always say there are two types of Quartz readers. We're not quite 5 years old. There's either people who know us and love us, or people who haven't heard of us. There's not a lot of wishy-washy in between, which is a terrific place for us to be, and a lot of headroom. But let me quickly, I'll speed talk through this part just to orient you around what we are, so you can, how we talk about ourselves, so you can think about it through that lens. This is the way we describe Quartz: a guide to the new global economy for leaders who are excited by change. All of those words chosen very deliberately and carefully. We say guide because we're not a website or a newspaper. There are a variety of expressions of Quartz out there in the ecosystem, and we want to keep ourselves honest on that front. We are unapologetic believers in the fact that there is a new global economy, and that is only going to continue to accelerate regardless of what the geopolitical climate is. And then, the audience, and I'll delve into this a little bit more deeply, leaders who are excited by change. I think that's an evocative phrase that you can probably conjure up who it is that we're talking about, the sort of the A-list famous poster children for the type of reader we think about when we're writing would be like an Elon Musk or a Jeff Bezos, is that kind of mindset. And as I just sort of said, we were born in the age of acceleration, as Thomas Friedman and others are calling it. Born in September of 2012, where these trend lines were becoming, crystal clear. The rapid, push of technology, data and information, globalism were all accelerating at a rapid rate. And I don't gloat about some of the success we had, because we were unshackled from a lot of the considerations that traditional publishers have had. We were born in 2012, clean canvas to paint on. A lot of publishers were still wrestling with how to just port their print content into a digital environment, never mind trying to figure out how to take the desktop expression of what you've done and fit that into a mobile environment. We could start from scratch. The two big subset trends of that age of acceleration that informed the way we built our UX and the way we do our journalism were these. These are not going to be big news to you guys, but in 2012, the pincer movement was on, but the lines hadn't crossed yet between amount of time spent consuming on mobile versus desktop. This is now a 3-year-old slide. This is from 2014, and you can see that has completely shifted. Time spent consuming on mobile devices has outstripped desktop, whether you are in the first world or in emerging economies. 70% of our readers come in through mobile. More than 70% of our page views are on mobile today. And then the other one is this, is people beginning to, social is the shorthand for this, people wading in and out of streams. I don't know if you guys have seen this slide. It's from the New York Times Innovation Report. That was that deep study, the internal study that they did to keep themselves honest about pushing more aggressively toward innovation in a digital age, and it got leaked. This slide jumped out at me at the time. This is homepage traffic to the New York Times, and this is not to take a shot at them. They, at this time, have more traffic coming into the website than ever before. But in my mind, the New York Times is the last place in America where you'd expect people to abandon the habit of typing in nytimes.com and walking in the front door to see what they had to say that day. And yet this was happening. So people are promiscuous. They're spending time in news apps. They're spending time in social media. And the way they're coming to you today is through the side door. They're clicking on stuff in their feeds, in newsletters, but they're not walking in the front door anymore. And so those are the conditions under which we built Quartz. We built for for mobile devices first in terms of design and UX, desktop second. And we were not precious about trying to make sure that we were driving you to QZ.com, but comfortable with the fact that if we stripped all of the friction out of discovering us in whatever feed or stream you were in, we could actually grow our brand, grow our audience, and actually grow QZ.com. So we launched without an app. There was no app to download, no reg wall, no paywall when we launched in 2012, a critical piece of it. This shift to mobile and social, to me, has created two dynamics that we can all think about. One is an incredible opportunity for us to engage audiences in ways we haven't before. I think Melanie in the last session said, these are deeply intimate devices on which people are now consuming, so there's a great opportunity to engage them. This data is a little more relevant, again, to us trying to reach business leaders, but 82% of B2B buyers say that a vendor's social content had an impact on their decision whether to buy or not. Huge opportunity for what you guys all practice. 68% of people who are making B2B purchases have bought something, a B2B purchase of $1,000 or more on their phone. And then the last one here on the left, you can see people, at least in our world, are beginning to abandon the traditional means of collecting news. Conversely, the opportunity to repel them is just as profound and just as dangerous. You've got to be really careful about the user experience, and that's one of the things I'll try to talk a little bit about today. Ad blocking is growing. We all know this. The reason it's growing is because these experiences are intrusive. 88% of the audience in this survey said that they would hesitate to go back to a website after having a lousy experience. And you cannot underestimate the importance of the user experience being one that is friendly and seamless. So quickly the audience, and then I'll get into the how we do what we do. Again, for you guys, I think you might know this, some of this data. Wow, that fell over on its side. That is not at all what that slide is supposed to look like. So that slide goes up and to the right as you want it to do, and with it, I guess what happened is it got so steep it just fell over. But today, I'm proud to say, at 5 years old, we reach roughly 100 million unique people a month across all the different platforms on which you can engage with Quartz. That big steep climb, which happened about last year, is derived from doing Facebook video, native video published to Facebook, which has the advantage of, we're doing a great job of that, has the advantage of not only engaging audiences with that particular type of content, but it's actually doubled, it's helped double the number of followers that we have on Facebook, which drives back to the owned and operated site. Hopefully this, yeah, okay. So here's what that thing looked like when you break it down. We've got about 20 million readers globally that come to QZ.com. We just hit a new record last month in August, 22 million. Roughly 500,000 people wake up with our daily brief, which is an email newsletter every day. We launched an app for the first time last year. It has almost 800,000 downloads globally, 5 million on news aggregation platforms, 3 million followers on our social media, and you can see 155 million people, unique people watching our videos on Facebook. So if you make an earnest attempt to try to dedupe this, there's no scientific way to do it. You come up with roughly around 100 million people on Quartz. That's just to give you a sense of whether we're doing what they asked me to come up here and talk about or not. And then for us, what matters as much or more than how many we're reaching is who we're reaching. And what I love about this is over time, 4.5 years and multiple sources of syndicated research, we are at the top of the heap. We're at parity with all of the bellwethers, Wall Street Journal, the FT, The Economist, Bloomberg, you pick it, Fortune, Forbes, at reaching the decision maker class. If you look at C-suite, if you look at business decision makers, if you look at affluence as a proxy for those things, Quartz is at parity with those guys. Or at the top of the heap, but with an audience that's about 9 years younger. So we're also attracting the right kind of audience for what we're trying to do, both journalistically and as a business. So let's talk about the approach. I think this is where hopefully you guys can draw some lessons for your own practice. The Quartz approach starts with this sort of foundational notion. One of the things that we're fond of saying is that we make big decisions with our gut and little decisions with data. People have created, quartz has become an adjective or a verb. People have said to me, I want to quartzify this, or that's very quartzy. They've done that for us. And what they mean by that, I think, is our distinctive tone, our design approach, our angle on the subject matter that we cover. And that's all very tied to this notion of the human element. Using our intuition to try to create things that are engaging, interesting, that are different from everything else that's out there in a meaningful way, because of that second quote that you see from Kevin Delaney, my co-president and our editor-in-chief, is that we're writing for humans, not robots. And I think that all too often is forgotten in our practice, is that there's a human being at the other end of this transaction that you're trying to get some sort of reaction from. And if all you're doing is optimizing for algorithms and robots, you lose the magic and the chance to kind of really engage with them. Two examples of how we do that, what I mean by big decisions with the gut, little decisions with data. One is our app, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a couple of slides. But when we launched our app for the first time last year, intuition told us nobody needs another news app in the world, right? These are unloved things. You download them, nobody uses them. All you're doing is porting all the stuff you put on your website into an app format. That doesn't actually serve anybody at all. And so instead we launched with more of a chat interface. All of that was gut intuition. It was an intuition. We didn't grind the science on that. We just thought this would be interesting. Once we put it out in the world, we got really interested in the data. Were people downloading it? What were the interaction rates like? What were the open rates like? Were people spending time with it? All of that sort of reinforced that, yeah, wow, we've got our hand, we've created something special and distinctive here. Anecdotal evidence, people tweeting about us. And then sort of the big data point is last year, as many of you may know, for the first time in history, time spent in messaging apps outstripped time spent in social media apps for the first time last year. And that was a data point that said to us, okay, yeah, we've made a really interesting and good decision here. On the negative side of the ledger, when Quartz first launched, we wanted to avoid comment sections. We thought that they were kind of a mosh pit for trolls and really actually took away from the experience on a sophisticated site. And our intuition said what might be interesting with this kind of sophisticated audience that we're reaching, who are probably experts themselves in a lot of things, is to actually let them annotate articles kind of at the paragraph level. And so we thought if we created a barrier where you had to register and then you could only comment at the paragraph level, proving that you'd read deeply and had something interesting to say, that this would create a much more interesting, lively conversation that even maybe our journalists could derive value from. We launched that out into the world and it didn't work. The data showed, very few people registered. There was very little interaction ever happening, and so we killed that project. So those are examples of what I'm talking about there. So a couple of other things that I think stem from that whole notion of using your gut versus just data express themselves this way. So one of the ways that we assign content at Quartz, and the taxonomy of the site is built around this if you want to deep dive on certain subjects, is this notion of obsessions. It was born out of necessity in the beginning. We were 35 people in a loft in Soho setting out to cover the world economy. There's no way that you could do that comprehensively with that small a group. So we started to think about how do we focus ourselves here? What do we do so we avoid boiling the ocean? And came up with this concept of focusing on what do we think are the obsessions of our target audience today. And let's focus on those things. Those obsessions could be derived from, eventually become derived from data that shows what are the stories that are most interesting, where do we get the biggest audiences, but they're derived also from our own expert journalists who have obsessions of their own that we thought dovetail. And that has worked so well for us that what we've done is actually now, 5 years later, we got 150 journalists on 5 continents, we maintain this concept because what it allows us to do is make sure that every single piece of content on Quartz is somebody's obsession. It gives it a greater chance to be engaged with, to be shared, to be a delightful thing. The way we do obsessions, what you see here is kind of what I call our longitudinal obsessions, our long-term obsessions that are going to be relatively permanent on the site. But another way that these exhibit themselves is we can spin up short-term obsessions. So during the Indian election a couple of years ago, we had an obsession on Modenomics. During the World Economic Forum or the Olympics, you can spin up a 3-week obsession where we put a concentration of journalists on, following the news cycle. We had a 6-month obsession last year on Bitcoin. And so one of the things I think that you can take advantage of as a content marketer is thinking about what is your organization obsessed with, or more importantly, what are the target customers that you want to talk to? What are they obsessed with? And focus on that, not necessarily always what your sales channel is obsessed with, or the rest of the organization is, but focusing on what they're obsessed with. So that's one thing that we do. Another tactical approach. This has been out there for a while, so at the risk of hitting something that is redundant, I love this because I think this is really interesting. Anybody seen the Quartz curve before? Okay, only 1 or 2 people. So I'll just first of all say that the math is not perfect on this. It's not true every single time, but directionally it's something that we follow and that shows up in the analytics. So this is a classic smile curve. On the y-axis you have traffic or impact. How many people read this article? How many people tweeted it? What did they do with it? And on the y-axis, you can put a number of different criteria, but the one that I'm referencing here is length of a story. So from 0 to 1,000-word stories. In that trough in the middle there, what you see, what tends to die on the social web is the 500 to 800-word article, which is the common unit of production of most news operations for over a century. All of the institutional muscle memory, and those of you who have worked at newspapers might know this, is built around that 500 to 800-word article. It's what fit in column inches, physically, and a whole host of things. The problem with it is it doesn't do anything distinctive, and therefore is not rewarded with the thing we're all after with content marketing, right, which is word of mouth writ large, which is the attempt to share and engage with that content in a meaningful way. So what we try to do at Quartz is avoid that middle trough and have you go left or right of that, which is where things really sing. So on the left side of this curve, what you would do is skip the throat clearing and paragraphs of setup and all that nonsense, deploy imagery and infographics so that you can convey a lot of information quickly and get in and get out. Make somebody smart really quickly. They'll reward you for that. They'll share that. Conversely, and you'll see this in later slides, people still to this day, they will read 10,000-word New Yorker stories on their phone. And there's a reward for deeply reported pieces in terms of narrative and the depth of coverage that also gets shared and spread across the social web. So this is one of the things we try to do, is live on either side of that curve, not in that middle trough. I have a great narrative flow normally. Here's another thing, and we call this things, oddly, we call it things. We have a things team at Quartz. And what they're after is, in any article or piece of content that you put out, try to find the one thing, the magic thing that is just interesting about it, and surface that. So one of the methods that we use with our reporters is we ask them to write their headlines before they actually write the article. What's the concept for this story? Write the headline first and write it as a tweet. And if that seems like the most boring tweet in the world, no one's going to click on that, no one's going to share it, no one's going to like it, maybe you haven't uncovered the thing inside the story yet. And this is not, here's an example up here, this is not to take a pot shot at really important and expert journalistic institutions, but this is how 4 of us covered the Gap Inc.'s earnings report, which was a gloomy earnings report. And you can see the kind of typical headlines from traditional news outlets that don't necessarily tell you anything. They don't draw you in. You're not necessarily going to read that. Our reporter found in sort of deep diving on this story that one of the reasons Gap's numbers were off was Banana Republic's performance. And one of the reasons Banana Republic's performance was off is that their manufacturing and production had really slipped. Among the anecdotes and the things was this, is they lost a ton of money on shipping blazers globally for women who couldn't actually fit their arms in the armholes. And so we surfaced that as the headline. That draws you in. That's much more interesting. The rest of the story is also an earnest report on Gap's earnings report, but this makes it more interesting, more shareable, more findable. And so those are things that we focus on.